So I thought we'd take a look at Charles Dickens' famous novel, A Tale of Two Cities. An absolute masterpiece if ever there was one. And I particularly like this copy because it's got a lovely picture on the front. It's Wordsworth's Classics 1993. Out of print now, but you know, if you want to find it, there it is. Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities is the most widely sold book in history. It's sold over 200 million copies. To put that in perspective, think of the entire Harry Potter series, how wildly successful that was. Well, altogether that sold 100 million. So Tale of Two Cities has doubled that. Dickens called A Tale of Two Cities his best ever novel. And it's easy to see why he says that. I don't think it is his best novel, but it's a terrific explanation of the motives and the reach of the French Revolution. When you read this book, you get the sense that Dickens is somewhat worried that what happened in France could also happen in Britain. This is an idea that I think he also seems to be suggesting in Bleak House. But here it's very overt. And the way that he's talking about the past French Revolution, it's interesting that one of his characters, Jerry Cruncher, is a resurrection man, or he's a gravedigger. And in some respects, because he ends up as a very bit part player in this, it's almost like Dickens saying that he's resurrecting history for the reader to just think about the social reform movements that are going on and how far they can go to the detriment of people, even though they start with a good motive. So, let's get into the book itself, its plot. A Tale of Two Cities starts with probably the most famous sentences in all of English literature. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, and so on and so forth. We all know that. It was the best of times, the worst of times. We're quickly introduced to Dr. Manette, who is a character that was locked in the Bastille in France because he dared to criticise the aristocracy. In fact, he doesn't even know why he was locked up. And he's reunited with his 18-year-old daughter, and they quickly hurry out of France to the safety of Britain. And there they set up life for themselves in this little out-of-the-way corner of London town. Now, ostensibly the central figures of the story, Lucy and Dr. Manette really act as an observation post where Dickens can have a look around the time of the French Revolution and start analysing what was good about it and what was bad about it. He seems to be looking for the warning, cautionary tale, as it were, to the French Revolution. To do this, what he does is he introduces us to two characters in Paris called Madame and Monsieur Defarges. They own a wine shop in a poor region of Paris called Saint-Antoine. And it's in their wine shop where the murmurings and the plottings of revolution begin to pick up steam. You can tell that straight away because all the men there are called Jacques. It's a clue that they're all being secretive and no one's giving their real name. Madame Defarges, wow, she is an absolutely brilliant character. She's one of the wickedest women in all of literature. Never in your life have you seen knitting look so malevolent. In fact, later, when a simple man merely asks, "What is she knitting?" she says, "Shrouds." And there's a little chill goes down your back. It goes down that man's back as well. Through these two characters, we find a very strong dynamic where Dickens begins to look at the pros and cons of the revolution. Monsieur Defarges is in favour of the revolution because he sees the wicked way the aristocracy deal with the common people. There's a scene where a marquise is actually being driven through Paris in a coach too fast and he kills a young child. And instead of feeling any remorse, the marquise just thinks, well, why is the man, the father, making so much noise about it, and throws a gold coin out as if he can just pay for something he's broken. So you can see that Dickens clearly sympathises with the French Revolution. He recognised that things had to change and he understood why the peasantry raised up in revolt and got rid of their overlords. With that, he's fine. And Monsieur Defarges seems to epitomise that characteristic. But his wife, Madame Defarges, who carries on knitting and knitting and knitting all the time, she clearly has an axe to grind. And you actually find out what it is later in the story. But she epitomizes the merciless nature of the reformers. Those dogmatic characters who always get within a social movement and bubble to the top, and then replace the tyranny that they're getting rid of with another tyranny in its place. Madame Defarges cannot sense any reason to forgive any single aristocrat. They all must die. So that's what's going on in Paris, one of the cities. Over in London, there are two other characters who come into the orbit of Lucy and Dr. Manette. The first one is Charles Darnay, a young man who, it turns out, used to be a French aristocrat, but has fled to England, where he is living like a common man in the sense that he's teaching people French in order to pay his way. And he falls in love with Lucy Manette. There's another man called Sidney Carton, who he's very likeable, but you want to hit him upside the head occasionally. He's a dissolute. He's a lawyer. The first time you see him, he's staring at the ceiling for a good half an hour. He's insanely clever, but he's dissolute. He's a drunk. He can't be bothered to motivate himself. He could be someone, but he's not, and he knows it. And shame is really brought into his life when he sees Charles Darnay, because Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton are doppelgangers. They look exactly like one another. There's some foreshadowing when these characters go to Lucy and Dr. Manette's apartments. The place where the building is has got this corner in the garden that constantly echoes and reverberates with steps, even though there's nobody around. But there's this constant echoing of steps. Lucy says she feels in her fancy that they're the sound of steps which are about to come into their lives. Well, of course, she's talking about getting tangled up in the French Revolution. And this happens when Charles Darnay's uncle leaves his estates to Charles Darnay. And Charles thinks, well, I don't want to go over and just use it for myself. I'm going to repair the estates and hand it out to the local citizens and let them benefit from the lands and do them some good, because Charles hates the oppression of the old regime over the poor and the low. Now, obviously, as he decides to go to France when things are really getting a bit Tabasco, you start shouting at him, for goodness sake, man, don't go, they're going to kill you. But the point that Dickens is making is that not all aristocrats were bad. Yes, he sympathised with the revolution, but he recognised the revolution really overreached and actually just put as merciless a bunch of people into power to replace the merciless old regime. And this is something that it seems Dickens is focusing on because, of course, Britain at the time was undergoing many social reforms. And it makes you think, was Dickens trying to say, be careful that these reforms are not overreached by dogmatic factions and used to wield power? And was it also his way of saying to the nobles of Britain, be careful how you treat the lower classes. There's only so much oppression people will take, otherwise you're going to have a French Revolution on your hands. Back in the story, Lucy Manette follows Charles Darnay over to France, where things really aren't in a good way. And things get quite depressing, to be quite honest. It's all very touch and go. The people that accompany Lucy Manette to help her, which includes Sidney Carton and a man called Mr. Lorry, who is also an interesting character because he's dispassionate. He talks about everything as being business. Just think of it as business. And that allows Dickens another way to travel back and forth between the cities dispassionately. In a modern thriller, the story would be about Charles Darnay going to France, getting into trouble and how he gets out of it. But Dickens's point, and this is the thing about classics, they're discussing a topic. They're trying to analyse an idea. He doesn't want to just do the thriller escape like the Scarlet Pimpernel. He's trying to see what the French Revolution was like, why it was right, why it was wrong, where it got tripped up over itself, where it did injustices. And that's why he has this character, Mr. Lorry, going back and forth, because Mr. Lorry is totally dispassionate. Although he has feelings, he tries to conduct everything in a business-like way. Of course, all of the characters, as always, come together. I won't tell you what happens. If you would like me to go deeper in depth because you've already read A Tale of Two Cities, please leave a mention in the comments that you'd like me to make that video, and I will. But for now, I want to keep spoilers out of it. You'll have to see how everything works out. But know that Dickens is not passing judgment one way or the other. He's asking you to examine things. Now you might think, well, this all happened ages ago, so how can it apply to me? This is why we read the classics. Timeless messages. Are there social reform movements today? Are there any areas where you see people maybe abusing power? Do you sympathise with the need to change things around? Now, I don't mean politically, I just mean you see this on the world stage. Now, do you sense that movements can get too much power and overreach their authority? Could it be that maybe the more volatile and dogmatic elements of a movement are rising to the top? Tale of Two Cities gets you to engage in that idea and then to be able to draw conclusions about the world around you for yourself. That's why a classic is a classic, because it gets us to analyse our own lives and to examine the motives and attitudes of the world around us and whether we are being drawn along by them unwittingly. A final thing that Dickens does look at in this novel is the power of the individual doing the right thing over the mass movement of doing something right, which can actually trample other people. And you'll see that in one of the characters we've mentioned. I'm not going to mention who it is though, but it will break your heart. The final sentence of the book, I can read it without spoiling anything because it's a sentence you all know. It's the most famous closing line. That's an interesting thing, isn't it? This book has the most famous opening line in literature and the most famous closing line in literature. The closing one is, "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known." So, that's my discussion of A Tale of Two Cities without any spoilers. I hope it's motivated you to read it. And if you want an in-depth analysis of the book, please mention it in the comments. And if I get sufficient comments, I will definitely make it so that when you've read it, we can have a look at the different characters and the different stories and viewpoints that they're all bringing to bear on one topic. If you like books, you love classics, or you want to get into the classics, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so that you're reminded when I release any new video on a classic piece of literature.